Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me here. My name is David Norn. I'm Manager of Environmental Services for EBA Engineering. We're an engineering and environmental company that's out of Santa Rosa. We've been doing this work for about 20 years. And I was asked to give the contractor's perspective. And actually, we are a contractor. We're an A contractor. But I'm also a consultant, so we kind of play a dual role. And just that we're on the bit of the dark side. So as we go through this today, by the way, I was asked to bring the perspective of what we do during the tank pull. Because in my experience, the CUPA inspector and your process as a permitting and jurisdictional agency is to essentially, in our world, you show up, you permit that work, but then your on-site work is really limited to pulling the tank, witnessing the soil sampling, and then anything beyond that. So I was asked to basically give a scenario and the considerations of what happens with a tank pull before you get there. So what happens in our world, and I'll start off here, is the phone rings. That's when it starts. So, there's a myriad of different ways that tanks are used. I was just talking to Brenda. Brenda's in a highly industrialized area in the LA basin. Sonoma County in Northern California, where I've worked, has got a bit of both, but it tends to be rural. We have dense urban areas too, so there really needs to be an assessment of what you're dealing with, because you really find everything out there. And in our planning, we essentially take it in 3 bites. So we have a planning phase. What are we trying to do here? Of course, you're trying to remove a tank, but there's many considerations that go with that. Through that, then we have an assessment of our site conditions and constraints to what we're trying to do in this process, and finally the site work to pull that tank out of the ground. And to kind of give a perspective here, the front end work to this is robust. There's a lot to consider on many of these sites. So looking at this, kind of just to walk through this a bit, pre-planning work scope, a constraints analysis, and what we're talking about is basically what would impede us or constrain us from doing this work in a safe manner that's effective and cost effective at achieving the goal of removing a tank safely. So for us, if we're working in dense areas, it's often access. How do you get in and get out? Traffic. Are we working in a dense urban area where we have traffic issues? Staging. Where are we going to put dirty dirt? Where are we going to put clean dirt? Where's the tank going? Where's our safety zones? Neighbors is always a big consideration if we're working in urban and actually rural areas as well. I'm going to mention safety twice because the consultant is oftentimes, we are the safety officers on site. But safety is first and foremost one of our considerations in tank removals. Of course, you've got hazardous atmospheres, you've got equipment. If you're working in a dense area, you've got a lot going on that, safety is a primary consideration in doing this. I included client objectives because oftentimes in doing this work, you're trying to do more than one thing. Yes, you're trying to get a tank out of the ground, but oftentimes you're going to do that in conjunction with maybe decommissioning a whole site, or maybe even as part of a big swing through corrective action. So client objectives become a consideration. Costs, I would tell you that the costs become very much a consideration. Pulling a tank is an expensive endeavor, even for a small one. We're talking thousands of dollars of work. And then as work goes, if your objective is simply to pull a tank, you're talking a pretty manageable work scope. But if you're going to tear down a building, pull a tank, invoke corrective action, and dig a site, then your costs and your considerations become much more complicated. I included here OSHA consideration 29 CFR Part 1910. In our world, we're all OSHA certified, which has all the attendant health and safety monitoring that goes on with that. That includes contractors and subcontractors. And then there's also the regulatory process. So you as CUPA folk, you guys have a mandate out there, and in my perspective, the jurisdictional issues are important to recognize. I have not found that CUPA agencies oftentimes have the authority, regulatory authority and jurisdictional authority to allow corrective action to take place. Oftentimes it's passed from being a leaking tank site, and then it's going to be a local oversight program or perhaps a regional board. So there's jurisdictional differences. For us, how we handle that is agency notification, so that we're talking about when that tank pull happens, we have a witness there from either regional board or LOP. That's typically how it's set up in our area. We really don't have LIAs. we're typically regional board and LOPs, and they have a vested interest in how this goes. So planning and permitting, we prepare under our professional registration a work plan and site safety plan. It's the document that sets forth how you're going to do this. It should recognize how this tank was used, to the best ability what this tank was used for, during what time period. It should recognize and set forth how you're going to remove this tank, what's the cleaning procedures, analytical testing requirements, site restoration requirements, and then finally a site safety plan. And the site safety plan oftentimes can be, 3-4 pages, but we have certainly had sites that have issues on them. Say, like, there's a site, I've got some pictures a little bit later, that was a coal gasification plant that had a vast array of polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons and heavy metals on it that really added many layers of site safety in. Permitting, when we're talking about permitting here, really the CUPA permit is a pretty standard permit for us. Form A, Form B, which is a standard state permit that goes with that. But also when we look at it, I included encroachment on the bottom here. Of course, there's an air board permit for fugit emissions. And I include the public health, LOP, and regional boards in here as attending agencies that are interested in the work. Subcontractors, we're an A contractor, so I bring in an A hazardous substance removal subcontractor, and I've worked with the same contractor for about 20 years. I find that those guys are highly specialized. They really know tanks. They are very good at what they do, and they're efficient. So under the state contractors law, then A hazardous substance removal contractors are a requirement to bring them in. And then we also have site-specific subcontractors, and I'm talking about a pumper disposal company that comes in and removes the liquids from the tank, takes our rinsate, washate away. We have a laboratory that we work with, and restoration contractors, geotechnical, structural, paving, traffic, and perhaps more than that, by the way, as you analyze your site constraints and how you're going to go about this. Site work and planning, I kind of went through some of these, but I'll do it again. Access and staging is a primary consideration. You need to have room for equipment just for safety. You need to have safety and exclusion zones so that you are, for one, keeping out the people that shouldn't be on your site. People typically tend to be curious about what you're doing, and I've had people walk on a site with no consideration at all about what the heck you're trying to do and walk up to an open pit. So I like to establish safety and exclusion zones. As we go through a planning process, then it kind of breaks out into some natural things. Before that CUPA agency and inspector and that tank pull happens, you've uncovered that tank, you've pulled the backfill material and bedding out of it, you've washed and inerted that tank. Once, and between the inertion of that tank and cleaning and the UST removal is when we schedule the CUPA agency to be on site, and any of the other attending agencies, by the way. There's a removal process that happens so that we witness a tank pull, we pull soil samples, we decide whether we have any other things we're going to do there. If we're going to vote corrective action, then there's a process to move on to our attending agencies. And then with UST removal, there becomes a part of hauling that tank away in a safe manner, so scrap metal or haz waste. And then once that is done, my experience is the CUPA contractor is gone, and then we restore the site through backfill and compaction, restoration, which is usually paving, concrete work. If you're in a site that you're in the public right-of-way or you have public structures, you're then required usually by permit to restore those. Staging and access considerations, again, clean materials. There needs to be a designation between what are you doing with this materials. Typically, your contaminated materials. A lot of the tanks that we deal with out there, we find that they have leaked, so we have contaminated materials to deal with. Equipment requirements. Typically, you're talking about a backhoe or a small excavator, or perhaps even a large excavator. Our rule of thumb is a steel tank typically weighs 1 pound per gallon of tank. So a 10,000 gallon tank is typically 10,000 pounds. So to reach out and over a pit and to pull that tank out of the ground, you need a pretty robust excavator or backhoe. I mentioned sanitary facilities because oftentimes these are old sites that are abandoned brownfields. I need to provide sanitary facilities, and I just mentioned that. Water is something that we use from the standpoint of washing these tanks, getting them clean. Traffic and pedestrian controls, I got some slides on this. Again, that's more about exclusion, permit requirements, and how you're going to do this safely. And then you have encroachment, which is, again, kind of getting out. We often load trucks in public right-of-ways because a lot of these sites are small. You can't get them in the site and you can't get out. So I got a bunch of pictures here. This is basically a bunch of sites that we've worked on over the years, and I'm just going to show by example then what are some of the things that we run into. And again, this is prior to a CUPA personnel coming for inspection. So we've got a 330 cat excavator. As you could see, we're in a downtown area. We've got a truck. We're loading out some material here. We've got some rather big power overhead lines. There actually is some requirement to stay away in separation distances for overhead power lines based on the ampacity of the lines. But this site, just getting in and getting out of here, this is the backfill stage of the same job. You can see the excavator's been parked, but we got a backhoe and a bow mag in here. You could also notice that here's my staging area. I've got, and I use my pointer here, that we've got sanitary facilities in the background. I've got fencing. I've got pedestrian and controls, and I've got a site that I consider to be well in hand. For me, that's a first and foremost issue of safety, but it also, for me, as a CUPA agency, when you walk on a site, you should not have loose ends out there about safety, access, exclusion, or what's going on with the site. We like to keep our sites tidy and neat. The structural shoring here, by the way, is very much a safety issue, and we've got some pictures of that as we go. And by the way, not all sites are on a corner city street. I included this. This was a little site in Petaluma that this house had a heating oil tank. There's a fair number of heating oil tanks out there in my experience. This one's in the backyard, and I just bring it in here because getting in somebody's backyard of mom and dad's house where they lived there for 50 years and they've got their prized garden can be a very tricky endeavor. Here's the tank right before it came out of the ground. You could see just by the nature of the tank, it's an old tank. I don't know if it's welded, but it's an older style tank. This tank had probably been here from the early 1900s. Traffic. I'll bring traffic back in the fray. We have a job going right now where I have a traffic plan, and this is about access and egress. Our permitting agencies are typically municipalities or counties through public works. The Caltrans manual is the typical rule of thumb for us to work off of. This is about as most complicated as you could get, by the way. Oftentimes you're simply trying to get in and get out, but there is a signage requirement. Those are prescriptive distances based on Caltrans requirements. There's pedestrian. If you're going to block off a city sidewalk, then you need to have certain signage out, certain distances, close that sidewalk and provide access and crossing on city streets through different means other than to walk onto your site. Contaminated materials. This is a tank pull that was out in Forestville, a pretty nasty little site, some old gas station, our nice kind of frothy water with floating product on top. You know, a tank pull can quickly turn into an endeavor where you've got a tremendous amount of contaminated materials, and you need to have contingency planning for this. Now, you may not know that going into it, and in fact, oftentimes it's better to know when not to do something. This site had a certain amount of work done on it, which included this day the removal of the tanks. There wasn't a lot of corrective action that happened this day, and that was more the reason that, and I'll mention this now, is that again, the CUPA agencies, in my experience, have limited jurisdictional authority to allow or approve on a leaking tank site to go forward and go after that contamination. There's some other considerations within that as well, in that if you're going to go after a site and say invoke corrective action by pumping that groundwater or digging that soil, you have to plan for that. You have to know how deep and how far and how wide, because it's very easy to have 250 tons of contaminated material above grade before lunchtime, and you don't know what you're going to do with it, and you never really had an idea how you're going to do it. This is a site of red dye diesel. It's an old diesel tank, free product. By the way, I am a strong advocate, if you are pulling a tank, to allow some potholing and some just a simple investigation, just to see what's there, not to generate a tremendous amount of soil, but sometimes it's better to know what's there. If there's an edge, I know just in talking to Brenda that there's been discussion earlier in the week on some of the forums about, you know, invoking corrective action. Well, that might be a good thing, but again, you don't know how deep or how far or how wide you're going to go to get this. You're really kind of stepping into an area where if it's cleanup fund eligible, you're in a big gray area and you could generate a tremendous amount of cost that you may not be able to get back. I have a stockpile picture. If we're in dense areas, or for that matter, even rural areas, we underlay and cover our stockpiles. oftentimes you need to characterize this material and take representative soil samples so you could get it into a facility. I'll go back to safety and exclusion just for a moment. So first and foremost, safety, absolutely for us. And we take that seriously. Fencing and shoring, we talked a bit about that. Establishment of clean areas is a very important thing for us. We need to have clean areas where if a site is dirty, if we're going to take soil samples out of this site and sample and analyze these sites to 0.5 part per billion of old organic compounds, the last thing you want to do is mix up everything and have dirty and clean and no exclusion. You really need to establish that. Safety requirements in a meeting, what we do in the beginning of the process, from the time that we get on site and we bring people onto that site, is our site safety plan. We have all subcontractors that come on site read that plan, sign that plan that they read it and understood it, and then they become essentially deputized under that plan. We have registered people on site typically that we then manage that process. We manage clean air monitoring and ambient air monitoring because that's set forth in our OSHA requirements. So again, it's safety. Setbacks, we already talked about that. Utilities, overhead and underground, again, are super important. There's prescriptive requirements out there for underground services alert. Everybody's well aware of that. We oftentimes will bring a private locator in to supplement that USA marking and give us a better idea about where utilities are. The motto to live by in our world is take 5 and stay alive. Take 5 minutes and assess what you're trying to do. Make sure you have a safe environment and don't take chances on this. This site right here actually is interesting. This is the City of Santa Rosa Fire Department. We've done a lot of work for municipalities. We're installing shoring prior to a tank pull. To the right of this gentleman on your side, you can see in the background there's a brick building. It's actually a boiler that feeds this building, and we're installing the shoring. Not only are we on the property line, but there's a 4-inch high-pressure gas main that goes in between the main building, which is off picture to the right, and our shoring. So if we go through and look at this, structural shoring becomes a requirement for stability, but it also becomes a requirement for, okay, we're going to do work here. We're going to dig a big hole in the ground and pull. There was actually 3 tanks back in this corner of the property, and of course we want to do this safely. This is a pretty intricate shoring job, so we had structural calculations before we went in and did this. The excavation contractor was also he's very proficient in shoring. So you can see it's gusseted and boxed. It has whalers on it. It's chained as a secondary holding mechanism on this. And you can see in the background the fiberglass tanks. This is downtown City of Santa Rosa, where we actually had some tanks in a corner of a property, and they had a gas line. Through easements and some history of easements and looking at recorded documents, you could oftentimes find that these are here. Your USA mark should absolutely call this out. But nonetheless, that's a pretty sizable gas line, and it fed a small neighborhood. Last thing I want to do is hit a gas line. Same site, looking at it from a little bit different direction. So just kind of showing how we've set this thing up. We've shored it. We shored it on 2 sides, actually. You could see our structural requirements on the shoring side. You could see our exclusion fencing. You could see, actually, at the same time, traffic controls out and about. Some of that's pedestrian and the signage in the far background. I'd point you to here, this is a site actually that has some corrective action going on. This is a steel standpipe that we used oftentimes. There's drain rock in the bottom of this hole because we had very shallow groundwater, which is the case in our neck of the woods. Groundwater sometimes is 2 feet. And so we had invoked corrective action here. We not only pulled out a lot of soil, but we also pumped groundwater. Oftentimes that can be efficient. So let's move through just uncovering the tank and some considerations, because again, this is, in my experience, before the CUPA agency and inspector gets on site. So that process then is uncovering the tank, easy, removing the bedding and backfill, making sure that you're putting that in your zones where you have a set up and your potentially contaminated zone. You're going to open the existing fill ports and vents on that tank, and you're going to start a removal process of the liquid contents of that tank, sludge, and start a process of cleaning it. We typically use a steam cleaner and water. In my experience, that's been a very effective way to clean tanks. So you're starting to wash it. We at that time have a non-haz waste hauler come in. We use an EPA ID number, which is a non-haz waste disposal event, and we simply bring that in, pump, clean, and that guy's out of there and down the road, and I don't have to deal with dealing with water on site. Cutting a tank, I know that there's been some talk this week in some of the earlier sessions about cutting tanks. I've seen contractors get in with a Sawzall and cut a tank, And we typically are advocates of using intrinsically safe tools. If it's a steel tank, that tank should be grounded before cutting it. And you absolutely should have LEL and internal conditions of that tank known before anybody starts to cut anything. So here's the site. We're uncovering the tank. We're simply busting concrete. My friend John's excavating has a 3,000-pound wrecking ball, and he's really good at using it. So we're actually busting concrete, and there's 4 tanks under this site. These tanks are actually here. They're uncovered. This was a 1930s gas station, 550-gallon tanks, 4 of them. They were just right out in front of the site. In the background, you should notice, too, this site actually had an oil-water separator sump, and it had an in-ground hoist. So oftentimes, from the CUPA standpoint, you may have other things going on out here. You may be doing other work, or the contractor, consultant, or client in decommissioning this old gas station wanted this stuff removed, and it could be a very appropriate time to do it. You've got an AHAS contractor on site, you've got everything set up, it's really efficient, it's got a little bit different mechanisms to it, and maybe even different analytical requirements, disposal requirements, and handling, but it's something that we often will do at the same time. This is its oil water separator. That you can see that this thing actually is it's a poured in place concrete device, and it just basically got popped out of the ground. It was intact. This is a little site. We pulled these tanks last summer. This is a really interesting site. It's very rural out in Occidental, out in God's country. It had 3 550-gallon tanks that were inside this little fueling shed building, and site owner really wanted this shed. And you could see it's got hand pumps on it. Those are vents sticking out of the ground. So, you know, getting in here and getting out of here, we've got an operator on the hoe, and we've got a site helper here just guiding things. So slow, go steady, take 5 and stay alive, and make sure we're doing this safely. This tank's been opened. You could see, and by the way, this is an old single wall steel tank. A lot of the tanks out there right now that we're running into, they're not the corner gas station. These are the old tanks that are unknown. And these tanks, by the time that we removed the fill and the vent ports, it's actually the dispenser and vent port, the metal just gave way and broke. So there's no cutting here at all. This tank was simply a rotten little tank, and all 3 of them were actually the same. These tanks had not been used since 1961, and they still had some fuel in it. They had water in it too, but we went through and did this work. I bring this site in here, and I've got a couple pictures of this site. This site's really interesting. This is the coal gasification plant. These tanks right here are some of the most interesting tanks I've run into. They're 2 10,000-gallon tanks. It's an old PG&E coal gasification plant, which actually they had many cities and municipalities had coal gasification plants that were prevalent around the turn of the century. They used either liquid or solid feedstock. They threw a gasification process in a retort and heat, and they generated a flammable gas. So it was before actually we had natural gas to be provided by a local PG&E type utility. These tanks were actually some of the waste tanks, and so these were full of PNAs, polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. This site also, from the standpoint, from the historic site use, it had extremely high levels of lead. So lead became a real driver. In the background, you'll notice the blue roll-off bin. I think we had 5 or 6 of these bins on site because the metals concentration in this soil, in the overburden and the excavated bedding, was high enough in lead that it became a Class 1 waste. So we don't want to stockpile that on site. Can I save questions until the end? So this is a bit of a different animal, right? And this stuff's highly viscous. This is old waste material. So we've got some guys here. You can see this tank's actually elevated a bit. We've got steam cleaner on one side and a pumper on the other because we're just trying to get this stuff to flow. You could also see that this tank, just by its very nature, is riveted together. It's old, it's rotten. A little bit more on this a little bit later. So we're just, here again, trying to clean this thing and get it safe. We actually did this site on a weekend because this is in the middle of a bank parking lot. So sometimes you have to do things a little bit different. And right next to this, behind that soil stockpile right there, is a 65,000 square foot commercial building in downtown, professional building. In the background, notice the fencing. We got everything kind of working here for us, but nonetheless, a serious endeavor to pull 2 of these tanks. I include this picture just because this is another fire station. I think the firemen were were wanting to get some SCBA training the same day. So these guys suited up in full SCBA suits. My experience, by the way, is they didn't need to do that, but nonetheless, there they were. You could see in the background, we have a shored hole. I've got my subcontractor in here. He's going through a process of washing these tanks, getting them clean. We have a pneumatic chisel, a metal cutting device so that we can cut these tanks safely. It's going through the safe process of cleaning and opening this tank. And here we are doing a gas tech metering of the tank to check low explosive limit to verify that not only is this tank clean, but it's safe then to deal with.